Good evening, everyone. This is entirely last minute, just something I've been working on for much of the day. Spent several hours on it. I thought it's worth speaking about. This is one of the many slide sets I'm working on, but this is something that really has been bothering me, and it's worth talking about. It's Luther's nominalism. So let me dive right in, and you might see why it's been bothering me and how this makes Luther not even Christian. I've been saying this for a long time. Now I'm starting to determine why, to gather the evidence to make this clear. So, yeah, I'm not expecting anyone to join me right now because this is entirely, I literally just made the decision and went live. So, now, Martin Luther, just as a basic introduction for those who've just stepped in, Martin Luther was deeply influenced by nominalism. He was a nominalist. So he inherits this philosophical system that denies the reality of universals like human nature, divine essences, goodness, truth, justice. So he then conceives of God's will as arbitrary and detached from reason. Now, you might find that the things that Luther himself says and what Lutherans or even Protestants say may differ, but we are very interested in what Martin Luther himself has to say for himself. Now, because of Martin Luther's philosophy, core Christian doctrines such as the Incarnation, Christ truly taking on a human nature, and natural law, which is objective morality knowable by reason, by your mind, lose their rational foundation. They all collapse into subjective interpretation and divine whim. So this philosophical inheritance makes coherent theology impossible. And I mean that, impossible. The reason I'm talking about this is just to get these ideas out and think it through, because I'm busy working on the slide deck and I'm just trying to see maybe how the audience receives it or how it comes across when I try to deliver it, to see if I'm making rational sense of how I'm putting it across. Now, rational theology, coherent theology, becomes impossible for Luther because faith is reduced to irrational voluntarism. This is the doctrine that the will, your personal will, your desires, your will, feelings, if you will, is a fundamental or dominant factor. So God is not inherently just because no universals exist. There's no such thing as goodness, morality, justice. These do not exist. These are fictions. So therefore, it is not God that is good. God's will at that moment in time decides what is good. Eating babies with hot sauce could be good because God willed it. And then later on, he changes his mind. And then later he changes it back. And instead of using hot sauce, he uses ketchup when he eats a baby. So you understand, this is whim-based, not rational, not consistent, not fixed. So then the will is the fundamental driver here, rather than a rational understanding of God's consistent truth, which we call the Logos. Now let me dive into that. So welcome, guys. Sergeant Grinch, century since, didn't expect to be here. Welcome. Body slamming Luther. It's getting worse. The more I read Luther, the worse it gets. This is, you have no idea how bad this is getting. This man was out of his mind. But welcome, guys. Okay, so Luther's rejection of reason, right? Let me just take away that text banner for a moment there. So we're talking about Luther's rejection of reason and how his nominalism changes the character of God. So God goes from being an objective divine being to a subjective projection of the self. Now, by denouncing reason as the devil's whore, Luther transformed Christian theology from a rational discourse about God, or a logical discourse, theological, into a confessional anthropology, as in, how do I feel about things? But here's a guide, a confession, a set of creeds made by Luther that defines how that works. So he fundamentally alters the character of God from an objective reality to a subjective human projection. Some historical context. So in the medieval era, you've got reason and faith in a traditional Catholic theology. This was the standard view up until that point. You have the scholastic tradition here on the left. You've got St. Augustine as key figure, 354 to 430. St. Anselm in the 1000s. You've got St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. And the core principle is fides et ratio, right? Faith and reason as complementary paths to truth. They support each other. Faith and reason working together. Faith and reason seeking understanding together. So there's a theological method known as theology as theologia, which is a rational discourse about God using both revelation and natural reason, your mind. Right? We can understand this from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia. Then you've got the nominalist revolution. You've got the 14th to 15th century timeline. So they go from Via Moderna, right, which is this nominalist philosophical view, and they start to raise a question. They're only asking questions, question everything, right? Understand those are very dangerous terms. Are universals real or merely names? Is goodness a real thing? Is truth a real thing, or just a name you gave to something you saw for yourself at that point in time? Is truth a real thing? Now you'd say, is he genuinely good? Is God's goodness a universal that is true for all time in all places? It's an objective reality. Or is it not? It's just God can do contradictories. And this is very important to understand that this would then make God Allah, right? Now, there's a philosophical shift from objective universals to subjective, highly subjective, personal, subjective views, feelings, experiences. So you have subjective particulars. It's only true for you in that moment. So as in your truth. So divine attributes are no longer anchored in a rational essence, like God is good because his nature is good. Good exists because God exists. Truth exists because God is truth. Those disappear. So you have Luther's connection to William of Ockham, and Luther says, I am of Ockham's school. I've covered Luther intensively in the past with his nominalism. So I'm not going to do every single slide. I'm still working on these, but I just thought, let me throw this out there. Did you think Luther used the cult methods to develop a following? I can't prove it, but I must admit, the more I read and the more I'm starting to sense that, yes, there's something. It's hard to prove. It's impossible to prove, perhaps, but looking at parallels I've seen with other figures in history, I can't escape the feeling. Let's just say I can't escape it. I can't prove it right now, but it's hard to escape. Porfirio says, when you place your personal feelings and thoughts over the evident objective truth, objectively you are abiding by your own revelations, not the gospel. And that's 100% true. So let me throw a few pages on and let me go through a few pages and just see where we end up. So there's a harmony, right, within theology. So faith perfects reason, right? Reason on its own doesn't grasp everything. There's a limitation. So faith takes us where reason can't go, but reason illuminates faith, right? Reason explains, it can defend, it can define, it can clarify what faith perceives. Welcome, Janice. So Augustine teaches that we believe in order to understand, right? We believe something so that we can begin to understand it. We apply our reason to it, but we also understand in order to believe. Now, faith offers truths beyond unaided reason, like the Trinity or Incarnation. Now, we do understand that there are things beyond our reason. God stands outside, but also God stands outside of human limitations. He created the universe. He stands outside of time and things, right? That's how we perceive God, very simply put. But we also realize that God is logical. God is rational. The universe can be understood because that's a faculty we inherit from God, from our Creator. Now, reason clarifies and defends the truth against error. We do realize that things like Trinity, like the Incarnation, those are things that are miraculous. They stand outside of the mundane human world, right? The world of physics and matter and mathematics and so on and science that we stand in, but we put that in a special category, a religious category. But reason clarifies and defends truth against error. So harmony of fides et ratio, right, of faith and reason. So Anselm defined theology as faith-seeking understanding. Now, faith is not irrational. It invites reason to penetrate into the mystery. And faith perceives these things. It understands these things that are theological. They stand outside of the standard mundane world we live in, and we realize there's a God, and therefore there's a category of things that faith apprehends. But reason allows us to understand these things and define them more clearly. So reason, when rightly ordered, will lead naturally to the threshold of faith. We can understand that there's something greater than us. We can understand there's a creator by seeing his works. Reason tells us there's something beyond us, right? And of course, we then apprehend the rest of it through faith. So theological science and Aquinas. For Aquinas, theology is a scientia grounded in divine revelation, yet it employs reason to systematize and to explain what it perceives. So reason doesn't generate revelation, but once revelation is given, reason can unpack it coherently and then defend its credibility. So you have two lights, you have one truth. So both natural reason, which is the created intellect, and then divine faith, which is infused supernatural light, come from God, and therefore they cannot truly contradict. God gave us both. God gave us reason, and he gave us faith. And because God gave us these, their God-given intellect and God-given faith, they then work together. This has been the standard view. Now, conflicts will either signal that you've misused reason or you've misinterpreted revelation. There is never opposition in their essence. This is the long-standing view. Now, the nominalist revolution of the 14th to 15th centuries was a decisive break from this classical scholastic realm, the objective realm, to subjectivism and relativism. So you have thinkers like Aquinas who held universals, goodness, faith, truth, justice, to be grounded in God's eternal reason, in his eternal character, his eternal nature. It's a fundamental, foundational nature of God. Nominalists, though, led by William of Ockham, reduce them to just names. They're just a name you give to something you personally experience that's only valid for you in that moment, through your personal subjective experience. So the consequences are profound. Divine attributes are not rationally knowable in their essences. There's no such thing as goodness. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as justice. It's just your experience at that moment. God decided this was just then. But there's no essential essence that exists outside and apart from your subjective experience. These are just arbitrary acts of God's will. So this weakens the union of faith and reason. And so you create a theology of voluntarism and subjectivism. So Luther locates himself in this trajectory, when he declares, I am of Ockham's school. He speaks of his master, Ockham. So there's the pipeline from nominalism to Reformation thought, and we're going to dive deeply into this over time, but I'm just trying to get my head around, have I described these, have I written this well, or do I need to change this, right? So authority shifts from objective universals to a subjective interpretation. Now, nominalism is a philosophy of unreality. So the core claim is that universals like nature, essence, substance, justice, goodness, and so on, do not exist. Only individual objects exist, or individual experiences exist. So reality is fragmented, known only through an individual moment, something that's happened to you. So therefore, you deny that the mind can grasp the objective truth of reality. So you go from objectivity to subjective experience only is valid for you. And on theology, there's going to be a fundamental effect. It destroys the Christian basis. So God's will is arbitrary. It is unconstrained by logic or reason. There is no more logos. It disappears. Ockham taught that God could redeem man by becoming a stone or a donkey. Jesus didn't have to be born. The logos did not have to be born as man. The incarnation didn't need to happen. Jesus could have come down as a beetle, a bug, your computer mouse, whatever. He could have done so because being born was an arbitrary decision. There was nothing deep about it. So the incarnation is not about the logos taking on human nature, because you have no human nature. There is no essential such thing as human. There are no categories. There's no men. There's no women. There's no categories. There's only a thing. And you perceive that thing as a man. There's a thing you see, and you identify it as a banana, but maybe it identifies itself as a chihuahua. So the logos taking on human nature, this is not about the logos taking on human nature. It was about God working as he wished, as his whim at that moment, in a manner that's unrelated to any sort of logic or reason. So the consequence is that incarnation ceases to reveal logos, assuming human nature, but it's just sheer divine whim. So natural law collapses. We'll talk more about this issue of natural law. But justice and grace are reduced to whatever God declares at his whim at any time. Whatever he does at that moment is justice. Whatever he does at that moment is grace. That's and then even contradictions then become justice. Even things that are utterly contradictory. Now, we do know that, or at least within Orthodox Christian belief, God does not do contradictories. God does not do evil, but under this system, God can do evil. And it's good because God willed it. God said so, damn it, and shut up. Pretty much that's how that works. So because of the arbitrary nature of reality, man cannot know the essential nature of sin and grace. Because what is sinful for you could be good for him, because it's whim of God, right? God decides. There's no eternal nature of God. There's no such thing as morality. There's no such thing as goodness or justice or truth. It's just what God decides in that moment. And just maybe, potentially, you are God, but we'll get to there. So he has no way of knowing his state. Man has no way of knowing his state, his condition before God, outside of a personal, private, subjective intuition and his personal inner experience. You add Luther's nonsense on top of this, and your conviction. If you believe you are saved, then damn it, you are, because your will and God's will are one. But if you don't believe it, you see, then your will and God's will are not one, so you're not saved. But if you believe, if you have faith and conviction, then you're saved 100%, because you are apprehending God's will, because that voice in your head is God for sure. So God's will is conceived as detached from any reason and any essence. He doesn't will according to his rational logos, but merely because he wants it. He says so. So justice, grace, and sin are arbitrary decrees subject to reversal or even contradiction. Am I making sense so far? I know this is totally odd, but this is genuinely the philosophy that Martin Luther glommed onto. And as you start to go through his own writings, the man was clearly out of his mind. So there's no natural law, there's only divine command, or shall we say Allahu Akbar. Natural law is the participation of human reason in the eternal law of God, right? So this assumes that man is a rational nature and that universals like justice or good are objective, real qualities grounded in his being, because those are qualities grounded in God. That truth, goodness, justice, mercy, those are real objective things that are grounded in the character and nature of God. They're part of the substrate of the universe. But according to nominalism, no. So logic, cause and effect, right? If universals like nature, essence, justice, goodness are denied, then man has no human nature. There's no stable human nature. Without human nature, reason then cannot identify universal good, like preserving of life, seeking truth, avoiding evil, because evil becomes whatever God decides at that moment, and good becomes whatever. And preserving life is arbitrary. It depends on the whim of God. And you can't know it because there's no external substrate of the universe that says this is a good thing. There's no such thing as good. So hopefully this starts to make sense. So what remains is not rational participation in God's order, but sheer voluntarism. God declares and man obeys. Allahu Akbar. Next, law is no longer discernible by reason, but collapses into arbitrary command, which may even contradict itself. So natural law collapses under nominalism because it eliminates any real universals. Justice and goodness are no longer part of creation's rational structure, but they are temporary decrees for now of divine will. So what is just today could be unjust tomorrow if God wills it, making morality arbitrary and unknowable by human reason. So that is the position that Father Ripperger cited, the Thomistic point of view, said reason illuminated by faith. So yes, so natural law collapses because without universals, there is no rational human nature to ground objective morality. So ethics is will-based. As Crowley stated, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. And so thus, this shifts. It's not stable. There's no foundation. So it's not based on reason and stable. It's just what you want, what you want. So when that logic trickles down to man, ethics becomes private will. Man becomes the arbiter, since there is no objective rational order that binds either God or the creatures that God made. So what is theology? So there's a fundamental contradiction here in Luther's theology, right? Theology is theologia, right? Theos is God and logia is rational discourse, logical discussion. So the classical definition is rational discourse about God using revelation and reason. Why do we need reason in theology? Well, they are universal principles, right? The law of non-contradiction applies to all truth, including revealed truth. Then you have historical precedents. So the early church councils like Nicaea, Chalcedon, they used very precise philosophy, very precise terminology to define core doctrines. So you must have core doctrines. You must have clear use of logic because you have to have coherent doctrinal formulations. You have to describe things with clarity, good grammar, and logic. You want to provide a rational defense against heresy. You want to systematically organize the truth, right? As Aquinas says, grace perfects nature. It does not destroy it. They work together, right? So, but Martin Luther comes along and says that reason is the devil's whore, right? So if reason is Satan's whore, if reason is the most effective tool that Satan has to pollute you, then theology becomes impossible because he rejects the rational faculty that makes theological discourse possible. Now, classical theology is the rational discourse of God in revelation and reason. Now, the church fathers and the scholastics insisted that the law of non-contradiction applies to all truth. So reason is not opposed to faith, but it's essential for doctrinal formulation, rational defenses, integration of truth, right? So when Luther denounced reason, he undermined the very faculty, reason, that makes theology possible. Theology is only possible because of reason. So if reason is rejected, theology becomes irrational subjectivism. It's no longer discourse, but it's your feelings, literally your will, your feelings, how loudly you scream, right? And how convinced, how convicted you feel, that conviction that could lay it on your heart. So in the Catholic scholastic tradition, precise philosophy means the use of logically coherent reasoning with clear terms, real categories applied to theology. At Nicaea, for instance, the fathers distinguished the same essence, homoousios, and homoiousios, similar essence. So a single dot here, a single letter, marks the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. Chalcedon defines Christ as one person, a hypostasis, with two natures, two physes, using strict categories to safeguard the Incarnation from contradiction, which means that Luther's use of nominalism utterly contradicts the whole view of God, the whole view of Jesus. All of that collapses. So nominalism contradicts this kind of precision in language and philosophical categories. He reduces universals to mere names, so you have no essence. There is no nature. There is no substance. There are no universals. So theology relies on these things for coherence, but if there are no universals, then terms like nature or essence of God have no substance. God's essence is whatever he decides. You can't know God. God is beyond any kind of reason. He's unlike anything you can think of, and he can change. That's Allah we're talking about. So there's only arbitrary will, right, or a subjective convention that you use for convenience. So you have scholastic realism. It's a coherent theology with precise categories, and nominalism, it's incoherence and voluntarism. So Luther aligns with Occam and inherits this contradiction. He tries to do theology while insulting and scorning the rational method that makes theology possible. So if essence, nature, and substance are names, then the Chalcedonian definition of Christ, one person in two natures, collapses. There's no natures. There's only whatever you feel like in the moment, whatever God feels like in the moment. So there's no stable nature for Christ to be God and man because there are no natures. There's nothing inherent. There's only individual events, individual particulars. There's no categories of, like perfection is a category does not exist anymore. God can't be perfect. God just is whatever God decides. There is no such thing as perfection. There's only God just does what he wants because he can, because he said so. So under Luther's nominalism, God becomes sheer will, becomes Allah, not logos. So this is all arbitrary. Christology resolves because divine nature and human nature are then empty words. This union of God and man, right, cannot be rationally confessed. So Luther's framework cannot uphold Christian doctrine, right? So what remains is not Christianity, but a voluntarist fiction because there's no categories. There's a God of will, not the God of logos made flesh. Does all of this make sense to you? Do you understand what the implications are here? So along to our chat, I'm trying to make a historical link of these nominalist ideas and Luther's from the pagans to modern relativists. I've covered that in my previous talks on nominalism and Luther and Aquinas. So I'll skip over this slide. Let me see. So also, followed through logically, voluntarism implies that Jesus did not pre-exist as eternal God the Son, right? So I'm still working on this. Okay, I'm still working this through. So yeah, but basically Jesus doesn't exist. So let me skip forward a little bit. So Luther denounces reason. His last sermon at Wittenberg, he calls reason the devil's bride, the lovely whore, right? She's the foremost whore the devil has. Reason mocks and affronts God. Reason, your use of reason, your use of your mind is an insult to God, because God's a theological concept. It's a faith concept. You can't use reason with faith because you're insulting and mocking God. So how the heck do you know something without using your mind, without using reason? Well, use your feelings, right? So faith is how you do this. Faith. But what is faith? That's your conviction, your belief. Faith alone, your conviction, your certainty, which is entirely subjective, because you can't use reason, because reason in spiritual things has in it more hideous harlotry than any harlot. If you use your mind to try and understand God or understand theology, you are essentially, Satan has convinced you to succumb to him. So reason is the devil's greatest whore. She ought to be trodden underfoot and destroyed. Reason is the devil's whore, right? So now, according to Heike Obermann, he's like the premier scholar on the Reformation. He says this represents Luther's final word on the relationship between faith and reason. So this is in the final 3 weeks of his life. He writes this final sermon for Wittenberg, right? His alma mater. He writes this. He reason satanic over 30 times, if I remember the count correctly. His audience is his Wittenberg congregation, and he breaks with more than 1,500 years of Christian tradition. Right, now, Etim Online, he uses, now there's the word obscene, canem, filth, okay? So, I need to fix this slide. So let me just fix this slide. I see I've made a little boo-boo here. Good grief, let me just fix that. And we're back. Okay, so now the word canem, right? This comes from the 1590s, but Luther uses the word, the modern usage, but Luther uses the word in Latin, apparently canem or senum. It's basically, it implies something offensive to the senses, right? And we use it in the terms of obscene. So reason is obscene, it's offensive. It's offensive to modesty, it bodes ill, it brings bad things, it's indecent, it's impure. So he says here, for instance, what I say about the sin of lust also applies to reason. Reason mocks and affronts God. We must guard against reason. As a young man must resist lust, so reason is by nature a harmful whore. She won't harm me if I resist her. I trample reason and its wisdom underfoot, and I say, you cursed whore, shut up. Are you trying to seduce me into committing fornication with the devil? That's how you purge reason and are made free through the word of the Son of God. You tell reason to get lost. I destroy your wisdom and I trample it underfoot. This struggle will go on until the last day. This is what Paul wants. We are to quench not only the low desires, but also the high desires, reason. So apparently the Apostle Paul wants you to get rid of reason. Lock away your brain, stick it in, under your bed, right? When whoredom invades you, strike it dead. What is whoredom? Well, that's using reason. That's using your mind, right? So see to it that you hold reason in check and do not follow her beautiful thoughts. Throw dirt, canem, senum in her face. Throw feces, poop, okay? And make her ugly. See to it, so this is Martin Luther, Luther's Works, volume 51. That's his sermons, okay? So in his last sermon, right, at Wittenberg. So now look at the sexual characterizations, and thanks also to Ignatius about this. I've known about this, but he added some perspective that's really, really helpful here. So look at the categories of denunciation, but also this, he makes a systematic attack on reason, right? And you can see why Protestants have to defend against this, have to pretend it didn't happen, right? Or somehow try to say, well, actually what he meant was the usual nonsense. So he uses sexual metaphors, reason, the logos, right? And as Ignatius was saying to me previously, Jesus is the logos. God is the logos, right? Jesus is the logos. In the beginning was the word. And the Word was God, and the Word was with God, right? In the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was with God. But he says, hold on, the Logos is the devil's whore, the devil's bride, a shameful whore. So seriously, but in this context, he's casting aspersions on the Logos, technically on Jesus, right? The Logos. And he uses animalistic terms. Logos is a beast, a stupid beast. It's an enemy of God, a source of mischief. It is carnal, it is sexual, it is awful, lustful. It must be trampled underfoot, it must be destroyed. There's over 100 recorded denunciations across Luther's corpus. And he does this, he writes about this, and he uses these terms over and over for 30 years. It's not like he just made it up one day and forgot about it. He does this for 3 decades. And then his last sermon in Wittenberg is one of his last 4 or 5 sermons before he dies, 3 weeks before he dies. This is his final word on reason and logic. So reason is the greatest whore the devil has. Human reason is corrupt, and it is blind in divine things. Your reason cannot do anything with faith or any theological subject. With God, reason is useless. It is corrupt. It is blind. The whole Aristotle is to theology as darkness is to light. The Aristotle becomes satanic. Luther called Aristotle the destroyer of pious doctrine, the ungodly public enemy of the truth. So he's got a 30-year campaign going against reason in theology. Janice says, I am horrified. Yeah, it's Antichrist. It gets worse. Look, I've just been putting this together the last couple of days, and I'm really thinking it through. I'm just trying to talk about this to see if I can simplify it, and maybe I'm not explaining it as well. But what are you getting from this? I'd love to get your thoughts here. But Ower says, reason is a tool God gave us, and what he gave us, he wants us to use, but because of the fall, we misuse it. It needs to be illuminated by faith, so we use it rightly, but by itself, it is good. Yes. Yeah, Janice says, when you think it can't get worse. Yeah, it's getting worse. Yeah, sadly. So this denunciation, it was a break from Christian intellectual history. It is unprecedented. No theologian before Luther ever characterized reason as satanic, as diabolical, as evil, right? I'll do 1 or 2 more slides. So Luther's denunciation of reason wasn't casual rhetoric, right? It's a sustained campaign that spans decades. It is utterly unique in Christian history. So the Catholic and Scholastic, now there's a reason why I have such affinity with Catholic thinking and Catholic doctrine, because it's rational, it's Aristotelian, and I find myself that I do my best to be rational and Aristotelian, to use the laws of logic. Whereas I find that Protestantism, the more I dig, is irrational. It is just gobbledygook, right? So the Scholastic tradition upholds reason as a God-given faculty, perfected by grace. Luther recasts it as a satanic, evil adversary, a whore, a beast, an enemy of God to be destroyed. So his rejection goes to Aristotle's philosophical categories, but also the use of logic in theology. So if reason is corrupt and it is hostile to God, then coherent theology becomes impossible, because you need reason to make sense of things. Doesn't the Bible say, be ready to give a defense of your views? Well, for Luther, that was using swearing and shouting at people and just certainty, conviction, rather than a logical argument. So when we see Luther being rude and insane, then this is actually correct, because he's not using reason. But then he contradicts himself by using reason in his arguments, using reason in his other works, and he uses reason as a tool to explain things, but he uses reason as a tool to explain why reason is bad. Reason is evil. Reason is incapable of understanding theology. He uses reason to attack reason, which is retarded. So all you have is a rational discourse with your own will, your stubbornness, right? Your own whims and desires and wants, with passion, with emotion, with screaming and shouting, which Luther is well known for, and also subjective interpretation. So his assault annihilates the logos, the faculty that makes theologia, theology. He destroys it. He rejects it. So rational discourse about God is not possible. So faith is irrational voluntarism, breaking with 1,500 years of Christian theology. So nominalism dissolves universals, reduces theology to God's arbitrary will, not a rational essence. So Luther gets this from Occam. Actually, I can simplify some of this stuff. right? So, what do you think so far of this? You know, Janice, I stand with you on this. I read this man and I see a man slipping into madness. I have no idea why he wasn't in a padded cell. And I can understand why he's been whitewashed, why why the story we know about Luther is not true. Reading Luther's works, now that I understand him better, this man was incoherent. He was crazy. In a straitjacket. Yeah, I fully agree. So the original midwit. Yeah. So um reason, he says, is opposed to faith. Truth comes from revelation, not logic. You have to feel it. That's why it makes sense now. When I was younger and I felt so freaked out when this guy kept saying you've got to spiritualize it, got to bring it inside and spiritualize it. Like, what the heck does that even mean? So now, in the bondage of the will, he uses logic extensively, systematic use of cause and effect reasoning. Now, look, it's sloppy, it's crappy logic, granted, but he uses logic, or he thinks he's using logic. He claims to be using logic. He appeals to principles of non-contradiction when the man is contradictory to the maximum. So he uses rational discourse to defend an anti-rational stance. He can't escape the rational framework that he's condemning. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Honestly, the more I read this man, the more I'm thinking there's something wrong with the world. So his position is self-refuting because it uses a principle that he rejects. He's using his reason. But he and the Anabaptists called each other heretics because the error was that they were using reason to interpret theology, to interpret the Bible. So Luther cannot argue against reason by using reason. It's incoherent. So he tries to make a two kingdoms doctrine, the two-state solution. Maybe that's where they got this from. So you have the earth kingdom, the temporal kingdom, the highest rank amongst all things, the best and something divine. So reason is the highest, the best, incredible, divine. So reason is praised and necessary, just like the freaking Quran, where there's an abrogation and an opposite to everything. When you bring up but this, and they go, no, but the opposite is true, and vice versa, right? So, but the scope is that reason is applied to civil and government law, right? Civil government and law, to natural sciences and medicine, to economics and daily life. Reason governs worldly affairs effectively, but don't you dare bring it into church. So you've got the spiritual and heavenly kingdom. It's rejected. Reason is rejected. So theology and justification or salvation and divine mysteries, no, reason is an obstacle to divine truth. Reason's great for running the government or wiping your bum, but it's not good for working out divine truths, because reason, you got to shut off your reason. So the problem is you have an artificial division. Truth cannot be valid in one realm and invalid in another, because then you've got subjective truths, because there's no universal truths. You rejected universals, right? So truth is not truth. Truth is true here, but it's false there. It is exactly the opposite. That's a contradiction. So how can reason be both divine and diabolical? How can it be divine, a gift of God, and it's satanic and evil and a whore and God's worst enemy at the same fucking time? Sorry, jeez. So theologians cannot avoid using logic and reason. We have to write, to think, to comprehend. But Lutheran theology relies on rational argumentation to explain that reason is corrupt, satanic, gift of God. Does any of this make any sense to anybody? He was the original Protestant jihadi, for freaking sure. This is Islam, this is Sufism, this is Christianized Sufism. It is irrational Sufi trash. Sorry, but this makes me so angry to read this stuff. Protestant believer says, I get it. Yeah, so H.M. Fox, a cheap ersatz mimic of the mysteriousness that monastics spent their lifetimes carefully cultivating. No theology without reason. Yeah. Yeah, he's surely a big cause of the great falling away that Paul talked about. Yeah. So you have, but not to the extent, a lot of it are half-truths. Yeah, so hold on, what did I miss here? Tom says, this is awesome so far. Again, like an honest analysis without being politically correct. This is where it needs to be. Yeah, but Yeah, it's honestly, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I'm like, how can you not look at this man and go, this is garbage. This is complete and utter garbage. We need to throw Luther into the fire and forget that he ever existed. Because Lutherans, again, I published a video today, a short video. Lutherans don't confess Christ. They confess Luther because they interpret the Bible, they interpret Jesus, they interpret God through the Lutheran confessions. If you're a confessional Lutheran, you accept that Luther's categories, Luther's concepts, Luther's doctrines are how you understand the Bible, how you understand theology, God, Jesus, and everything to do with Christian theology. The problem is that Luther destroyed theology. He does confessional anthropology, how you feel about something, right? That's anthropology. That's not theology because he doesn't believe in logos, right? So as a confessional Lutheran, you are confessing Jesus Christ via Luther's interpretations. And then, of course, you have Protestants. Lutherans might directly take from Luther because they accept that this is confessional Lutherans will take Luther's categories and they have to accept because that's the church, that's the belief that you accept things as Luther said it because Luther's 100% correct. But of course, Protestants, you drink from the same well. The source is the same. You flavor the water differently, right? Some of you add some raspberry and the other guy adds Coca-Cola flavor, whatever. But you all drink from the very same source. You have the same doctrine, sola fide, sola scriptura, right? You are taking the doctrines from the same source. You drink from the same well. You might flavor the water differently, same source, doesn't matter. Or you use a slightly different analogy. You are standing on Luther's foundation. You're living in his house. You're eating his food. You're making his recipes on the stove. You are eating everything that he prepared. And then you're claiming, I don't follow Luther. I follow the Bible. You're living in his house. All you've done is you've decorated the room a little differently for you, or your denomination has decorated the room slightly differently. But the recipes you're using, the decorations, everything is what Luther gave you. You're working within the bounds of Luther's doctrines. You're claiming that, you're living in his house, you're sleeping with his wife, you are eating his food, you are watching his TV shows, you are saying the very same things he said. We can trace all of that stuff to stuff Luther wrote. And then you're claiming, no, I've never heard of Luther. Never heard of the guy who built the house I live in. Never heard of the guy that said all the things that I'm saying now that I claim I don't follow. That is just incoherent. I'm sorry, but that just doesn't fly anymore. You are serving a man, you are following a man, you are worshiping a man. It's the way Muslims actually worship Muhammad, but won't admit it. Honestly, the more I read Luther, the more I'm seeing this is exactly the case with Protestantism, very largely. This man was incoherent, he was insane, and obviously evil, destructive. This was not Christian. This is not Christian theology. There is something deeply wrong about this. So I will go back. I need to work on this stuff. I need to clarify this, but hopefully it's made sense. I'll try and clear this up. But yeah, there's something very, very bad about Lutheran theology, about Protestant theology. So let me see. What have I missed? I'm starting to think there's a possibility that of incarnation, Luther is the incarnation of Muhammad. It might well be the case. Your previous post was a response to the you have to internalize or spiritualize the divine third. Yes, you have to, but not to the exclusion of reason. It is needed so you do not get swept in the wrong direction. No, there's something clearly very, very subjective about this. So look, that's it. I just wanted to talk about this because it's been on my mind. I've been working on this for hours now. And yeah, what do you think? Am I barking up the wrong tree here? Am I just, but this is Luther. This is the history. These are the facts. Yeah, do you get the same bad vibe I'm getting? Are you as angry as I am? Or do you think I'm exaggerating? I'd love to know what you think. And hopefully you can provide a rational answer. I've had too many people go, you're wrong. That's not an argument. But Luther liked natural law. Luther said, and then very often someone will make a stupid comment, and I'm sorry, but these are stupid comments. These are people who think they're geniuses, they're Einsteins, and they make the most dumb comments. And I will spend the time to draft one or more replies on different points that they raise. I tend to write multiple shorter replies than one long one. And then someone will go, no, I don't accept that. That's not an answer. I had one guy say, you are wrong about this, blah, blah, blah. Just asserting, empty assertions. But Luther was fond of, Luther could not have been fond of natural law because Luther clearly denied natural law, right? And, but anyway, he was simply saying that, oh, you're wrong about this. And the church fathers agreed with Luther on this point. And if you want, I will get someone who will debate you, a Lutheran. And I wrote to him and I said, look, do me a favor. First of all, here are the facts. Here's Luther's own words. Here's the evidence. Please explain to me how your statement stands. Then also prove to me where Luther says what you say, to back up your claim. And then also show me where these church fathers that you spoke of make that claim. Please just show me the evidence. Quote me what they say that aligns. Okay, because I know they didn't. And then I said, look, give me the evidence and let's start with that. Okay, and if you want, I'll invite you on to make your case in front of me, and we'll tackle the evidence together. But I will give you time to make your case. And let's just say he wasn't willing to do that because obviously he wanted someone else to fight his fight for him, and he never provided me any evidence. I get this all the time, constantly, right? So anyway, this just drives me nuts. But yeah, so guys. So yeah. Okay, so guys, I'll call it a night here. I just wanted to do this quick thing just to talk about this issue, and hopefully you gained something from this. I'll be working on this. I'll come back to this to try to provide better examples. But was it clear? Let me know if it was clear and it came across to you well and you understand the implications. But there's something wrong here, deeply, deeply wrong. And this is not even Christian. This is absolutely, positively not Christian. This is Islamic. This is Sufi. This is incoherent, but it is not Christian. I'll leave it at that. So thanks, guys. Good night. God bless. I hope you had a wonderful Sunday. And I will see you guys soon. Take care, everyone.